Good morning. Yesterday, this will conclude what started yesterday where I left off. The slide here shows the part of the brain is and I looked it out off the brain stem. That was a anatomical advantage of the brain that that's why the way they understand. So while it seemingly to be safe, obviously that do things for judgment, balance, coordination, even a certain amount with vision. And a lot of those things are the things that factor into impaired driving. We didn't have anybody this particular meeting talk about impaired driving, but that's a good agenda item for the future. So to continue then with where we left off. Anybody know what K2 and spice are? K2 and spice are research drugs, never meant for human consumption. And yet, when those particular chemicals are sprayed on, you know what potpourri is, you know, the little things you put in for scents in your bathroom, the little dried up flower thing. Kids get it and smoke it and go nuts. And I don't just mean nuts, I mean really dangerous nuts. These were never intended for human consumption. There is nothing natural about it. They are lab synthesized compounds that were used to study the cannabinoid system. And so the problem is they're packaged in these ways and sold in gas stations up and down the coast. And this has been a problem recognized for years and years, but they're masquerading as therapeutic or plant-derived cannabinoids. Make no doubt about it, these are synthetic and they're entirely separate and different. So what I want to do now, without rolling on slides like this, is to tell you we know a lot about cannabinoid receptors. Actually, the actual imagery, if you've ever seen the new receptors or pictured, those squiggly lines, these are all the proteins. The way they actually look, they may look like cartoons, but these are derived from actual pictures of them. And yet in the middle, there's THC. This was the inspiration for how we found out about cannabinoid receptors in the first place. You may remember from yesterday, I talked not only about cannabis in that sense, but the opium poppy revealing endorphins, as well as the chili pepper capsaicin revealing endovaniloid receptors, all three systems of which determine how we interpret and assess pain as human beings. So I want to show you this slide because when you think about ancient cultures and how they interpreted health, what they thought health was about, I'm going to show you in just a moment something of an image that's going to have the same basic shape as what you see here. This is a 2013 PET scan. And if you look very closely off to the lower left by the wrist, that's an IV site where radioisotope labeled isotopes that are injected. Those particular isotopes are geared so that they will bind with CB2 receptors. Now, CB1 receptors we talked about already. We know a lot about CB1 receptors, the brain, all of those functions, the things that impart how we eat, sleep, how we relax, even forget, and also how the body protects. But the protects part comes from CB2 receptors. Those are found in the immune system. They're immune system derived cells. And what I want you to look at here is not so much the red color, because that also is influenced by blood flow, but the green, yellow, all that there, not only along the spine, but mostly look at where it is. It's the abdomen, it's the gut. Now, I'm not talking about internally in the gut, although, as some of the previous speakers mentioned, the gut microbiome is very much determined by the functions and actions of cannabinoids for health and wellness. In this case, I just wanted you to see the location where these are, because thousands of years ago, and I'm going to show you something from almost 2000, but at least 1500 years ago. This is an acupuncture chart, traditional Chinese medicine. And, you know, when you look at healers from different parts of the world and how they interpreted way back then health and wellness, we interpret the immune system to be consistent with life. You don't have an immune system, you're going to be gone pretty quick. In this culture here in China, they would interpret that as qi. Qi basically is the word for flow, which is what they realize the body needs with respect to how the body integrates with the environment. And flow is not through the brain, it's not through the heart, it's through the abdomen. If anybody's ever studied anything in acupuncture. Years ago at the University of Miami, I took a 105-hour CME course provided for physicians to try to teach this, because it's not something you generally get in medical school. So life and flow of health and wellness is well known through ancient cultures to go through the gut. Now, what did they know? Because they couldn't have known about CB2 receptors back then. But guess what? We interpret health and wellness as health. And guess what? It's life and immunity, which generally, if you think about it, this is a cultural extension for as human beings evolved, migrated, and went from different places in the world with different understandings of health and wellness. So in essence, here's Western medicine's new science future meeting a traditional Eastern medicine's past. And I think that's cool, but that's really at the core of, if anybody's ever heard of the phrase integrative medicine, there's your two side-by-side ways to link the distant past with the current understanding of, in this case, CB2 receptors, the sophistication of reminding you that yesterday I showed a slide that said by NIH MD Ph.D. researchers that modulating the endocannabinoid system has therapeutic potential in almost all diseases known to affect humans. That's cool, but this is where the action is for the future. Don't get polluted. Protect part of what I said, not the eating and sleeping and forgetting and relaxing. Those are brain things, okay? This is really what keeps you in the game as far as health and wellness. So moving on then, we have an industry now. And that industry is going to bring, and it's a burgeoning industry, considerations to public health. And that's what this theme of this whole meeting's about. What things impact Florida public health, of the cost versus the benefits. So when you look at it that way, docs are sort of being manipulated to a certain extent, aren't we? You know the adage about the horse getting ahead or the cart getting ahead of the horse? Well, if that horse really is the evidence-based data and the bioethical reasoning, what's right to do, it's a thought process. When it gets switched around so that you're limited to anecdotal reports rather than evidence-based data, and I'll say it this way, the plural of anecdotal is not data. Just make that clear. But also stakeholder bias. When that doctor thinks they're doing the right thing, they may have things a little backwards. So let's be the ones that hopefully steer the ship in this direction. So there was another slide shown, I believe, yesterday as well. And I want to bring back the ancients a moment, because while the acupuncture slide I showed you was one thing, this is the actual tomb in China of a shaman. Somebody who is special in their class. This is not, a pauper's tomb. But in the two vessels, the round vessels on either sides of the end of those arrows, were not only cannabis, but female cannabis flowers. What does that tell you? It tells you they knew where the chemicals were that were associated with health and wellness even back then. So this is nothing new. We haven't just suddenly discovered it. We changed the plant markedly, so that the concentrations are what are in those flowers now are very different. And I'm going to try to be constructively critical in the next few slides to show you what I don't think is necessarily keeping in track with the health and wellness. And I'm going to start the basis of that by showing you ancient fields that have listed and existed in other parts of the world for hundreds and thousands of years. This one's in the Middle East. This is in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And this is cultivated plants that are known as landrace. Landrace plants, by the way, are plants that represent really two things. One is the environment in which it's growing. So obviously environments have different factors, the soil, the temperature, minimum heat. Cold, of course, is important, rainfall. But it also represents something else. It represents those people's needs that are actually cultivating it. Those two factors are what determine landrace. And in this case, when you look at landrace fields, such as existed hundreds to thousands of years ago, they remarkably had almost similar amounts of THC and CBD. They were one-to-ones. And they weren't as strong with THC. They didn't necessarily have the existing terpenes that you'll see in most of the cannabis out there now. But I'm going to take you for what's happened for a quick ride in the last 50 years a moment about that contemporary cannabis that developed from traditionally balanced plants. And I mentioned the word landrace before, but what I'd like you to do in looking at the next few progressions of this slide is to look at the vertical axis on the left. That's percentage of dry weight or concentration. In this case, we're going to look both at THC and CBD to see what happened from those traditional varietals, which back then, before 1970, why is that a date in history? Well, number one, I'm in high school. But really, more importantly, it's the date of the Controlled Substances Act, which now redefined how we look at things as being prohibited, Schedule 1 versus Schedules 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are progressively less controlled, but nevertheless controlled. And I want to point out the differences in that concentration that used to be balanced this way, but down certainly no more than 5%, but 2, 3% is where most of this stuff was. That's why I'm showing you that graph before 1970. Well, let's look what happens now after 1970, because remember, up till then, everything co-evolved with balances. Now, modern hybrids express under prohibition that which is prohibited. It's not something that I'm making up now. The same thing happened with alcohol's prohibition. In alcohol's prohibition, nobody's getting money selling beer and wine. They're weak in terms of alcohol content. It's all about spirits, or that's 40 proof, and moonshine. So the lessons learned from alcohol prohibition of what concentrates do, which means if it's going to be sold illegally, it gets passed down along the line. You can cut it and still have the end user get something which has got some chemical in it, whether it's alcohol or THC. But I've also included not only a lot more THC than CBD in that graph there, in that yellow highlighted part, but also something called myrcene. Myrcene is a different kind of terpene. I'll explain to you why in just a moment, but I'm going to show you where the myrcene comes from. And the reason I'm singling out myrcene is because myrcene is different than a lot of other of the terpenes. I'm going to give you a good example. One of the other terpenes that's popular, linalool, is basically lavender, okay? Lavender is put into, say, bath soaps and stuff, so when you shower and the steam releases it, the smell, you don't think we have sophisticated smell, but smells determine an awful lot about how we interpret if something's healthy for us or not. You remember before COVID, going into a dispensary where they had mason jars filled with buds, the habit that a lot of people did is lift the lid off, put your nose in it, take a sniff. If it smells good, try that. Otherwise, no, I don't want that. Try this one. After COVID, we don't tend to put our noses in things like that anymore. But that's the way that plants are evaluated by animals and people. Your olfactory nerves are very close to your brain, right in the middle there where a lot of this other action happens. So terpenes and smells are there. It's the way the plant's communicating with its environment. It's not only the chemicals that are in it, but the way the plant that is existentially rooted has to find animals that find it, that it smells nice. A rose smells nice, or the shape of the flower to attract an insect pollinator. The plants are using their chemical arsenal in two ways. One would be to attract the pollinators to ensure their reproduction. The other ways, with basically alkaloid chemicals that are in many of these plants, alkaloid chemicals taste bitter. Animals don't like to eat it. It's the whole reason that, if you remember in Mary Poppins, a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, right? Okay. So it's because they taste bitter that you need something to sweeten it to make it palatable. Well, animals don't like bitter taste either. So it's another one of the ways the plants, whether it's actually a poison or not, keep animals from eating it. The plant's chemicals are tremendously powerful, and I have a healthy respect, as I told yesterday in the slide, for the powers of plants' chemicals. In this case now, I want to show you this plant. Because when people talk about sativa versus indica, this is the holy grail plant of what people would have regarded as indica. This is Richard Evans Schultes, a rather famous Harvard ethnobotanist known for many, many things for a lifetime of work. This is him in Kandahar, Afghanistan, which is a very different growing environment. Remember I talked about how important grow environments are? This area of the world are 8,000 high plateaus. That's higher than many of the other continents' highest peaks. And this is where this particular plant, Afghani Kush #1, skunk #1, this is that core plant. And its discovery back then by Dr. Schultes. And I'm going to point out three things about this plant that makes it different. Number one, it's got a lot of THC, dominant genetics. Got very, very little, if any, CBD. Again, not dominant genetics in this plant. And it's got a lot of this terpene that I told you a moment ago is called myrcene. Now, why is myrcene different? I'm an anesthesiologist. I promise you, I know the difference between something that is calming, sedating, or like we said about lavender, relaxing. Myrcene is hypnotic. Myrcene is hypnotic. What does that mean? Well, number one, it sets up a certain barrier for memories coming in. It, in a sense, then also can block old memories perhaps from coming out, which is why high myrcene content and a lot of THC are a favorite from people suffering from PTSD. They don't want to remember those memories. Myrcene, though, is different than those other drugs. I'll give you another example of myrcene. Hops is the closest genetic relative to cannabis. It actually also has a lot of myrcene. It's not going to get you high because there's no THC in hops. Hops used, of course, for beer. But you know what they do with hops in Bavaria today? You can still go to Bavaria and find pillows stuffed with hops as a sleep aid. So don't underestimate the importance of the smells, even though they're not going to get you high, with respect to what certain terpenes do to how we interpret things because of their action. So getting back to the slide with what's happened to the plant over the last 50 years, those dominant traits from Afghani Kush and skunk number 1 created short indica hybrids with the genetics that greatly improved and increased THC, basically wiped out the CBD in the plant, and really pushed myrcene in those hybrids that were made from those dominant genetics. So it makes sense then, over the next 50 years, which brings us to where we are today, those THCs, and I'm going to give you the number 25% here, don't hold me to exactly, I'm giving you a ballpark estimate to tell you that this, for a single secondary metabolite, to have the dry weight of a flower bud represent that much of a single chemical is actually quite a remarkable feat of agriculture and hybridizing and genetics over 50 years to reach that. But that's one of the spin-offs of what prohibition does. And I told you about moonshine from alcohol as the parallel to that. More recently, though, with CBD, you've actually got some plants now that are pushing up there, and I'm going to show you here, and I'm just settling down on the number 15% because this now is what some hybrids, I'm going to call them not just simply cultivars, meaning it has human cultivation compared to a natural hybrid in nature, but we're looking at it in the sense that it's a chemovar. That's the proper word. And by the way, people who call hybrids strains, let's work scientists here. So I'll tell you that strains refer to colonies of bacteria and viruses. Please don't use the word strains. You can if you want. You'll see it out there a lot. You'll see the vendors telling you this strain or that strain. They're chemovars, or at least cultivars, because their human interaction changes. So that 15% there is CBD now. Well, where am I going with showing you this now? If you look at what I've written in the lower corners, they're actually both unbalanced plants. Humans developed and worked with cannabis for 6,000 years of documented history, longer than that, closer to 10 or 12,000 for how long it's been documented that humans have interacted with it. But either of those plants in the whole plant is actually unbalanced. The balance point rests with those one-to-ones, and clinically it would tend to make, to me, the most sense that that's where you would start if you were starting somebody, especially a cannabis-naive patient, on something, because the CBD is there and it tends to mitigate some of the side effects of THC in of itself. And then from that point, if somebody seemingly would benefit from something with more THC, you could deviate off to one side, CBD the other. But as I mentioned with Dr. ElSohly yesterday in his April 2020 paper in Natural Sciences Products or Nature, you could look this up, that's where they talk about intermediates. And to me, clinically, that's a very important group that you should try to look for, but there are very few true intermediates out there anymore. ACDC, Harlequin, we're talking about things that need to, in essence, be recreated to find those one-to-ones. Yeah, you can take a heavy THC plant, grind up its leaves, and a heavy CBD plant and grind up its leaves and try to put them together and sell them as ground up combination of things. And that'll approximate that one-to-one. But there you're going to look even more critically at the terpenes that are associated with it. I'm not convinced that hypnotic terpenes are necessarily the best thing. Why? Because by blocking memory, once they get out into the general workforce, especially in a blue-collar state like Michigan, when it went recreational, the legislators are looking at, hey, we can tax this now and we can get a lot of money coming in. But what happens when you have to rely on a blue-collar workforce to keep your economy going? when the people who are using it may not be remembering what the boss told them to do the day before at work because they're enjoying the myrcene so much. So this is something that hasn't been thought through enough for what's getting out there to the masses in terms of an unbalanced plant. And so my final comment that I'll tell on the top is that unbalanced modern, doesn't mean it's healthier, plants actually devolve, they didn't evolve from traditionally balanced plants. There's my editorial on where the plant is today. We can do something about it because there are new hybrids coming out all the time. So I wanted to get through that slide to lead into showing you really where this all is, and it may be a little better picture than you've seen before and how it's changed. This is a bud, it's a female flower. You see all that frosting on it? If you look at it closely, those are actually going to be trichomes, but in this case, I'm pointing out that, as I told you before, maybe at most in 1974% THC, now we're pushing it up at least 20, 25% or more. That's an incredible feat. But where the chemicals really are, and the terpenes, not just the cannabinoids, they're all found in these structures called capitate glandular trichomes. What do they look like? Well, let's look closer up top a minute. If you look closer and looking at it, you'd see this actually looks like little golf balls on teas or mushrooms. And that's where the action is. That's where the chemicals all are found. If you rub them off manually or even chemically, freeze it down, shake them off, separate out just those, you got hashish. And I'm not making up that word. That's been used for thousands of years in other cultures to separate out those active chemicals. That's why people who look at a cannabis flower up close and see it, wow, that's cool, because that's where these chemicals are. I wanted to show you a robust flower bud with how many of those trichomes are on it. That's where the money is in terms of who's looking to develop the product. This is a slide from Leafly. And again, even that resource is using the word strains, but I'm pointing out that middle circle in there is approximating 1-to-1s. That's not what you're finding, though, available in the stores. What you're finding is on the bottom there, the total THC and dry weight, where it's pushing up in the 25%. To me, as a clinician, the money is that middle circle, but you'll be hard-pressed to find that in the stores. I'd love to see more of it. As far as that concentration, for those of you with pharmacy backgrounds, and I'll tell you that an anesthesiologist essentially is a clinical pharmacist and physiologist. You have to know the way these drugs affect the body. And toxicology is a field within pharmacology, with Pericles here famously having been quoted that the dose defines a poison. I can give you too much oxygen, I can give you too much water, and I can kill you. It is possible. So dose is critically important in cannabinoids. Now we're going to go to something that's pre-COVID. And I want to remind you that when COVID really hit, you remember when it hit New York real hard, they're wondering, where are we going to get ventilators from, right? Well, you go to December 2019, January 2020, immediately before that, kids were vaping black market. And again, this is the continuation of my talk on black, gray, or legal markets. Black market contaminants that were used to cut the oil. You put things that look like it in it. It seems like you got more than you really do. You sell it downstream to unsuspecting kids. They breathe it in, and what do you get? You get this. Okay, you see what she's holding up there? I want to start a no vaping campaign. And if you remember on the news, every night, national news, you'd see this. The CDC took reports on, and that's how they found out that vitamin E acetate, we talked about popcorn lung speaker before, but these are black market contaminants. The good news is the legal market here in Florida, those places across the country, they get checked. This is not coming out of the legal market. I want to be very clear on that the legal market is producing a regulated, clean product. That's very important. So how did we get here? This is 1970. And look closely at not just where everybody's cheering Richard Nixon for doing the Controlled Substances Act, which I will remind you is largely a pharmacy industry promulgated structure of Schedule 1 and then 2, 3, 4, 5, because it involves one chemical, usually one molecule, to treat one disease and to get one patent. So it shouldn't surprise you that the structures in the Controlled Substances Act were meant to develop that, because most pharmaceutical companies have 2 and 3 generations of drugs coming after they come out of their initial release and then become generic. So this is industry. But if you look at the top right, that's DEA and FDA. They have different functions. I showed them briefly on a slide yesterday with what their roles are. But jump forward now to 2018 and the signing of the Farm Bill. And now the DEA has been replaced with the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, where essentially you're taking something that was a pharmaceutical, as marijuana, and now through hemp, I'm going to say this, reducing it to the level of a nutraceutical, which has much less stringent guidelines than pharmaceuticals. And yet they're being sold to the public as being for your health and wellness. I just wanted to point it out because this is a political process. It happens. And we can have more of a dynamic interchange, perhaps when we're on the panel and I'm moderating a short while, about what really do you know about the differences between each of those two markets? Because that's what drives this whole industry, market forces. You'd like to think you're in control as docs, but you're really not. And that's why the horse cart analogy slide I showed before was so relevant. So moving then right along, this is what happens as a consequence of that Farm Bill. That Farm Bill had an unintended consequence. The original reason for being so popular at that time is you now had people who could farm hemp, and then they're looking at the magic new oil, and I didn't say snake oil. Cannabidiol is a remarkable molecule. We know actually not that much about all the different ways that it works. It doesn't only work through cannabinoid systems, but many other ways. That's part of the mystery of it right now, and I'd love to know more about it in detail, but it's just getting to be understood. However, because the Farm Bill allowed all states to grow hemp, there suddenly became a glut of CBD on the market in the last few years, which means that all the people who went into it farming and cheering around President Trump in the last picture now are stuck holding a lot of a product that they not only can't find people to buy, but the price plummeted, really went down the toilet. So what do you do with it? You find a new gray market way to change it. And you can subject cannabidiol to acids and change the ring structure. And I'm showing the rings here for Delta 9 on top. And I'm going to point out that whatever you think about the way the government has researched Delta 9 over the last 50 years, my response to that is, well, they've researched it over the last 50 years, good and bad, bias or not. We know a lot of interesting things about Delta 9. However, when you take that cannabidiol and you subject it to the acid to close this ring, you make an isomer of Delta 9 called Delta 8 THC. It is not a natural process it's going through. And yes, it exists in tiny, tiny amounts in the natural plant. And it's known to get people intoxicated. There are very few of the cannabinoids that actually imply intoxication. But what I've just shown you here is the very definition of a designer drug, designed to stay one step ahead of the law. And it's not unique to cannabinoids. Opioids have been doing that for years. So I have great concern for public health with this, because while with THC Delta 9 on top in green, it's been clinically studied, it's an intoxicant, and it's legal here in Florida. Delta 8, on the other hand, through essentially a loophole as an unintended consequence, is now available in Florida too, but we have no real knowledge of its study the way we do with Delta 8. And it can be sold to an 11-year-old in the gas station right here in our state. And if you listen to any of the speakers before me or me reminding you, you give kids whose brains are developing, and I'm not only talking kids, even in the fetus, things that impact the development of all those important connections that don't stop when you're a kid. They don't stop even when you're 18 and you get your 16 driver's license, 18 going off to college, fighting in a war, drinking alcohol. It's generally regarded as your mid-20s before those connections are established that are God-given that keep you to be the person and problem solvers you are today. When you give a designer drug that works in a similar fashion, not exactly the same, to kids, and believe me, kids will get it. Okay, kids get tobacco, cigarettes, alcohol, anything else, you know this. It's kind of ineffective to just simply put legislation in a given state. Mind you, about half of the states in the last few years have legislation about Delta 8. Some outlaw it completely. Some say, oh, well, we won't sell it to anybody under 21. Where they come up with that number I just finished telling you, your mid-20s is probably a better number. But it's quite naive to think that kids won't get something that's intoxicating. Okay? And I'm sending twin 18-year-old boys off to the University of Florida next month I'm assuming things, okay? But did they use it from the time that they were other kids before? No, not if they're going to be my kids and my own. So anyway, I want to see them develop to their potential. This is a statement from the FDA about Delta 8 toxicity, but the FDA is not the DEA. The FDA can collect data, and the data showed that 70% of the people who were exposed had healthcare evaluations, with 8% of the people actually needing hospitalization. There's a dose-related consequence usually of how much is taken on. But I want you to see the second bullet point there. 40% of those that were exposed involved unintentional exposures. You don't even know what you're getting and where you're getting it, because the controls over it are so far less than the legal Delta 9 market. And of those, 82% were unintentional exposures to kids. So that's the data, and that's a year old already. You can extrapolate the data now for what this year is. That's the FDA's disposition on it. While you can look at other things that the FDA says, and basically they're saying that we're really concerned, even in the states where it's semi-legal now, or I'm going to say gray market, because it's being sold along with recommendations and things of saying how good it is, trying to correlate it with what we know about Delta 9, but we don't know that about it. So they will push back and say that if you're going to say you take this and it'll help your cancer or MS, chronic pain, nausea, those are things that Delta 9 is known about, but not Delta 8. They are two different chemicals, and especially if they're packaged in ways that are appealing to kids, the FDA is going to push back on it. That was their statement in May of last year, okay, over a year ago. So why am I concerned about kids? I may have shown this slide, I think, previously, but I want you to look closely at those things that would be appealing, not just to kids, but to me. I know what they are. I love Butterfingers. And so look closely now, folks, because that's what kids are seeing. And this happens to be with Delta 9 products, but I'm saying the same marketing, the same way of making it appealing to kids is out there, and it's everywhere with Delta 8 without the constraints of Delta 9. That's about what's next to come. So I want to show you it real time. I'm not making these things up. You know, this is how it's different than K2 and Spice that I showed you before. So I'm going to wind up with this slide because this, even though it's from 2015, started showing trends, some of which are public health victories, less smoking. That's alcohol and smoking. You see the blue and the red there, down, 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 down. But data might not be as truthful as you think, because people will say, well, look at cannabis. It's kind of staying level. And yes, it went above cigarettes before with tobacco. But while I've given you a few correlates about alcohol prohibition, let's compare the importance of what's happening here of cannabis with tobacco, because the two have been inextricably connected ever since Columbus brought back on his second voyage tobacco, which is a New World plant, back to Europe on his second voyage. And it wasn't long before people in Europe put some tobacco leaves in with their cannabis leaves and smoked it. And you know what? The balance of the two is pretty fascinating, because you had a stimulating effect now from the nicotine offsetting some of the more depressing effects from the cannabis, and they've been inextricably connected ever since. How many of you know the really origin reasons for the names spliff, blunt, joint? They're all expressions of different ways you combine cannabis, whether it's a wrapper around it, mixing it all in. But I don't have to use those words with you now. They're all in vapor form. Juul, nicotine, cannabis, vape. You don't think that kids are vaping both together? That's the impact of when you have those two particular chemicals, cannabis going through a legal progression of its medicalization and politicalization, but nicotine is part of culture. It's legal. So I'm going to ask you from this slide here about concerns with cannabis going forward. If you have an industry with the marketing savvy of Big Budweiser, combining with an industry with the medical ethical scruples of Big Tobacco, what could go wrong with Big Pot? Right. Right. So this is University of Michigan. It's 5 years ago, but the trends are continuing. Less alcohol, actually less cigarettes. That's a public health victory, by the way. But when in combination with cannabis and nicotine, it's called, I believe, a Simpson paradox. A statistical aberrancy when you look at it and you really crunch the data for who's using and vaping what. Don't take the direction you see too literally and say, oh, well, cannabis is just level. Not more kids are using it. It's what they're using it with and in context for how much. And that's really what makes the difference for outcome. So when you look at studies done by the NIH, which are very few, longitudinal studies, as I discussed with Dr. Cook from the University of Florida, and the consortium is of great value. We have very few of them. And I mentioned something called the Dunedin study, which is not Dunedin, Florida. This is New Zealand. But going way back to the mid-1970s, they followed the same people year after year to look at outcome. That's really what's needed from the time somebody's young to old, and that's where you get the full picture, not a blip in time. So when you gave kids starting at 15 years old, or kids who were taking lots of concentrated or powerful, in this case, even back then, cannabis, and you have them not stop over the next 20 years, and you look at what statistically significant outcomes happen for those particular kids, it actually is IQ. Now, when you're born, you have a certain IQ. You can get tested when you're 3 years old for IQ. With some genius kids, get tested that way, and you get tested throughout life. You're basically going to stay right where you are. So believe me, 8 points is a big difference, because an IQ score, remember what IQ is. Average is not really average, but mean of 100 is what people sort of go by. You're a genius, maybe you're 150. You have serious problems, processing and solving problems, you're not 50, but that 100 points is not like 100 on a test where you get an A and you drop 8 points and you got a 92, it's still a low A. That's not the way it is. It's a bell-shaped curve. And when you take that 100 level at the top of the bell and you reduce it by 8 points down to that 92, it's actually the 28th percentile. So how many of you would give your kids pot, understanding that at a young age, that if you do it at a young age and they keep doing it, they may wind out as the 28th sharpest pencil in a box of 100. See what I've just described to you? This is the concern with not a perfect study, this longitudinal study, but don't dismiss it, because there's no other ones out there that will really guide you this way. Why it happens is now better known as far as neural formation over those critical years. But I'm pointing out to you that's a bad outcome. So what do we know? We know that cannabis use is associated with cognitive impairment, particularly impairment to verbal learning and memory. That cannabis-related cognitive impairment is generally subtle, not the kind of thing where suddenly they have it and the next day, they're not speaking in normal sentences. But most importantly, frequent, persistent, and earlier onset is associated with greater cognitive impairment. Keep it away from kids. And I'm not just talking kids. That's the problem with early neural development in the fetus, which is why pregnant women should not have it either. And I'm going to give you one more exception. My wife's from Jamaica. I know a fair amount of way it's used from cultures who may not be able to go to the fancy hospital and get Zofran and an IV put in to reestablish hydration in a pregnant woman in their first trimester suffering from the intractable nausea and vomiting of that first trimester. And people can lose babies with that. So if you go out in Jamaica, and I was asked to speak at UWI, the University of West Indies, in front of doctors, nurses, and the third group, herbalists. That's my wife. What is that? He says, that's plant practitioners, the people out in the sticks in the country who have been using cannabis for centuries. How would they use it? Well, they would use it by taking cannabis leaves and steeping it in a tea. Very dilute, not much at all, because that's all you need for basically suppressing that nausea and vomiting. And at the same time, by drinking the teas, they're restoring the volume that they've been losing, just to get them past that narrow window of time beyond which they would stop using it and then continue on. And guess what? The babies in Jamaica come out at very high, robust, bouncy kids with high APGARs. And you wonder why they're using ganja there, right? Jamaica's not a country of Bob Marley's. As a matter of fact, it's illegal there. You ever see the way the kids go to school? It's mandatory British type of education. In uniforms, they have to go through the whole program. They're terribly afraid of what happens if this gets out there and their kids start using it, and justifiably so. So what we still need to know, longitudinal studies, compare each person to themselves from before and after their absolute initiation of the use, and assess cannabis use prospectively. That's what you have to do to find the answers to things we don't know now. So where are we going from there? Driving, we didn't really include it today, but this is at the University of Iowa, tremendously sophisticated driving things used by the NTSB. And you can do testing on people with alcohol, cannabis, or both and see what happens. The prefrontal loss of inhibition with alcohol, I'll take the keys, don't worry, and go out driving with loss of inhibition and steering all over the place for speed and direction.
compared to the cannabis user that actually is more aware of the impairment. And actually, I don't know, but make the judgment erroneous call. I'm going to go out and drive. And I promise you, you've been behind them on the highway before, probably knew it, because they're the ones in the whichever lane they're in, going 30 miles an hour on the expressway instead of 60 or so. And with one constant finding, the inability to stay within the lane. That's the studies that come out of here. And I would hope that we can talk more about impaired driving and even roadside tests that are not like alcohol because of the way cannabis is not directly correlated with blood levels to impairment, especially in non-naive users. But this is a public health concern, legal concern, and what to do with impaired drivers with the more cannabis using patients we have out there, much less kids. So I'm going to conclude this slide right here. Public health. I showed this on Friday. Some of you weren't here. It was a pre-conference workshop. This is really what we're talking about. What are the leading causes of preventable deaths? And first on the left, there's tobacco smoking. Way out on the right there, and mind you, this is from way back in 2004, okay? 2004. But I want to look at the next, say, 15 years from here, because what happened in the next 15 years after this, tobacco smoking went down. I said before, that's wonderful. That's a public health victory. But at the same time, with lethal opioid overdoses, and remember, this is not looking at even the last 5 years. This is just up to 2015. Drug abuse went up, and it went up so much in those first 15 years that the trends over those 15 years from 2004 right up to 2019 became not the 9th most frequent, but surpassed motor vehicle collisions for overdoses. That was the first wake-up call when I started showing this slide. I haven't renewed it since, but now you got to add all the other OxyContin deaths that happened subsequent to 2019, but also fentanyl. And so now where that line is relative to toxins, even infectious diseases, which just had a boost up because of COVID, this is the way real epidemiologists look at the world for what we've done, what trends are, and try to head things off at the past. That trend is a dangerous trend. And you can see just since this new millennium, what we're doing with drug abuse and the consequences of these preventable deaths. So I'm happy not to take questions now because we have a panel coming up, but this is my direct email. It's the last session, so we may not be able to have as much time for interfacing with people, which is the wonderful part about these meetings, being able to network. But this is how to reach me. And so we'll change the slide deck a moment, have Ron Watson come on up. Bye. Thank you. I think we've got virtually coming in Dr. ElSohly, Mr. Demorejon. Everybody online with us?
I'm online, but I can't get my my video to start.
I don't believe our cameras are on that way yet either.
Yes.
One moment, we're going to switch to the first of a few slides that I'm going to show to lead into this moderated panel, some of which will deal with what you have, others with Pete, who's on. Pete, are you on?
I am on.
Thank you. Just
Good
hold on
morning.
a moment while I cover the first slides. I'll also be showing some slides involving our two live panelists to my left. And let me know when we're ready with the first slide, gentlemen. The last slide deck, closing session slides, please. Thank you. So I'm going to go through rather quickly here. Does anybody know what translational medicine really means? Translational research, translational medicine. It wasn't taught when I was in school with that term, but translational really means, in a short, basic thing, the fastest method for getting a discovery from the lab benchtop to the bedside where the clinical patient is, but with internal loops that go back and forth for continuous quality improvement. That's the way things are developed. It's the process. There's a method for it. And that's what accelerates new discoveries from that process, from the lab to actually getting it to clinical care. So I'm just starting off with that basis. Here's the representatives who are on our panel today, and I will be introducing them by name now, and hopefully they'll have a moment to introduce themselves as well. Ron Watson, you may have met before. Ron, of course, is Watson Strategies and the Director of Government Relations in the Northwest area, sales rep from Movement by Verano, and Mahmoud ElSohly, who we heard in a moment. Are you seeing us now, Dr. ElSohly?
I'm with you now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Of course, he's in Oxford, Mississippi, and I'm going to tell you again as a reminder that Dr. ElSohly, in over 40 years, as a wonderful Ph.D. pharmacist, I know him as a collegial botanist. We got that in common. He's a research professor, and he has been the person through whom which all of the National Institute of Drug Abuse's research data has come from. This is the government's grower. Now, who's not the government's grower? Pete, I know very well, for the last almost a decade, was on one of the original license recipients as their grower. I know him, and he's a wonderful grower, person who I trust, and hopefully perhaps even in the future would have some connections with, so as to develop not what necessarily is wrong with the modern plant, but to create new cultivars from someone who really does know what he's doing. Thanks for joining us, Pete. And
Oh, thank you for having me.
to our far left, Dr. Brian Pearson, PhD. This is from also the University of Florida, but his position and where he is a little different. He's not on the UF campus. He's in Apopka, just half an hour up the road here. This is a guy who knows a lot about not only horticulture, greenhouse stuff, and the chemicals we're going to be talking about a little bit that we expose the plants to, and what happens when some of those chemicals get in us, and they're not designed to be in us. That's the difference between a medicine that's going to be taken internally versus a tropical ornamental plant that you're going to buy just for your kitchen shelf or something. These are chemicals that are going to get in you. And some of them, if you think they're dangerous for bugs, watch what happens when they get into your system, where they work within your genome, and you forever going forward pass it on to your descendants. It's not pretty. So in moving along then, I just wanted to share a few of these basic slides with you to sort of show you perhaps a little bit of a bioethical rationale for why reason matters and why the process of discussing like here matter. So I'm going to read you now a slide without some common baseline of facts and with the willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponent's making a fair point and that science and reason matter. We'll keep talking past each other and making common ground and compromise impossible. I will push back, and you should push back, when the medicalization of cannabis, when its politicalization gets in the way of that. It's happened now for many years, and science and reason really do matter. That was one of the things that was on that fourth slide I showed last session. And so I'm going to show you a rather snarky title for a slide of something I gave a talk in years ago. On medical cannabis prohibition in the United States. Red tape, white lies, and blue laws. Remember what blue laws were with alcohol? You can get it here, but you can't get it there. Those are kind of unhealthy side effects. So instead of that, if we focus on the science and reason, that really is what matters. And I'm going to share this with you because this bothered me. This is actually from right before Florida had its first constitutional amendment attempt. That was a ballot initiative that did not pass. And this was a politicized parody. But you know what? I've got my FMA badge here. I took offense to this because this shows a guy from the FMA who's looking not only bored, but really responding to this little old lady who could have been my mother back in those days when she was alive, saying, I want medical marijuana. The guy says, nah, it leads to these unintended consequences. Here's OxyContin. So we've come a long way, and I promise you what you're seeing here is not reality, because the doc here looks entirely uncompassionate. And remembering that Florida's first law was called the Compassionate Care Act of 2014. Doctors aren't uncompassionate. We're being unfairly depicted this way, whether you're conservative or liberal or anything else. That's not what I'm talking about. Doctors have to use the scientific method. That's how we come up with looking at the data and sharing it from an educational perspective, how we want to have our patients make a decision along with our guidance as educated professionals. The scientific method is not uncompassionate. It's by definition dispassionate. You don't let the sales and the hype and the, things like that get in the way of your judgment. So I'm pushing back against that cartoon, but it was impactful. When people saw it, they're kind of criticizing organized medicine and the doctors. I encourage you, if you're not a member of the FMA, become a member, because it's the only way you'll have a voice in this process. What are the things that are influencing really coming out of prohibition business? I'm not going to go over all of these things, but these are the different variables that you can look at, not only a few years ago when it came out, but what's going to happen in the next year or two. This is a 12 to 18 month perspective. But obviously there's a presidential election coming up yet again, and that has big impact as far as negative thus far. That's what the colors mean. The purple things are things that actually are going to make it less likely that it comes out of prohibition, compared to the light blue colors, which are positive things. And again, the technology that goes into it, the innovations of product development, the advancements of things as far as legislation and the industry recognition and how it works with business are all positive things, let alone the majority of states from the actual constituents of the United States as a majority of a country with the majority rules impacting it. Those are all positive things. The mixed things are the big blue things, and we see congressional action. Don't confuse decriminalization with legalization, two totally different things. And so this slide, I think, is helpful because the same things that are going into the rationale for this exist today as it did several years ago before two previous elections. That's how long this has been out. So those are trends to watch still. Dr. ElSohly, I'm going to bring this up partly because of what you did with the USP back in April of 2020, which that is the last edition that came out. This is the United States Pharmacopoeia. This is what the federal government provides as far as education for physicians, pharmacists, general people, started way back 1820, 200 years that we rely on the federal government to tell us the truth. And in this case now, cannabis was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia, went into it in 1850, and because of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, it was removed in the next edition of this USP, it's called United States Pharmacopoeia, in 1942. I actually have that edition at home as a rare book, but it means that now for 80 some odd years, we haven't had the input from the federal government on this. And although the co-authors of the article from April of 2020's paper written by Dr. ElSohly talking about, don't think of it's indica, sativa, think of expression of plants that have a lot of THC versus plants that have a lot of CBD versus what I said before, the one-to-one, intermediates, as it's called in ElSohly's paper, that was co-authored by people from the USP with the proviso in the disclaimer, we don't believe this is the current, we're not making a statement for the group. But the reason I'm showing this for you is when it comes out of federal prohibition, that structure of how to define different types of cannabis, it's sort of a hint to you. Look at it this way and you'll be prepared for when it comes out of federal prohibition and stop thinking indica, sativa, they're all hybrids. So again, sativa, indica, not the way it is. And the particular book or paper there, this is the article from 2020. I encourage you to look at it with Dr. ElSohly and those USP contributors, good work. This is the future, people. So you're seeing it here ahead of time, even though it's already been out for 3 years. So this is getting into the details of what's in that paper that he contributed to. Again, THC dominant, CB dominant, or intermediate chemotypes containing both. And we're not even talking anything in that structure about the terpenes. I've already made my comment about the hypnotic effects of myrcene. This is my one little extra slide that I showed before about what happens when you chemically manipulate delta-9 into delta-8. These are covering things we could do as the group. But now I want to give you a little different opinion again about East meets West by sharing with you a traditional healer's perspective, what happens when you take the whole plant compared to pulling out components of it and how a traditional healer would look at the whole plant. This is a quote actually from anybody know who Deepak Chopra is? Okay, a lot of you are shaking your heads, yes. All right, so this is what he says. He says, isolating an active constituent from a plant is an affront to nature. It's like taking the intelligence and leaving the wisdom behind. This was the slide I showed before in the end. I didn't think I was going to present both content today. So because we've been through this, I'm just going to go quickly through that to complete it so we can start speaking with our panelists. And conclude with this. There's the take-home message from this meeting. And that take-home message, if you look at the joint there and the little mysterious smoke coming up, a little seductive thing, maybe looks like a little woman's image. You get in there and you realize that the seductiveness partly of this whole field. And it's kind of cool, the action of the plant, okay? And when you're looking at the recreational use, and I hate even the word because then they're going to say adult use, and it's a euphemism for it. But overall, even people using it illegally and recreationally are using it for a reason, just to chill. That's a therapeutic purpose. So I'm not going to try to get in distinct lines between medical, recreational, all that, just to point out that people have different reasons for using things, and using it for a therapeutic outcome is still the reason that most people might choose to even smoke it. Not that there's good things as far as smoking from an anesthesiologist, but look closely at the slide here a minute, because sometimes what it is a consideration of the temptations indulgence, and temptation offers you choices. Okay, not everybody has to use this. Don't try to give it to everybody as your best shot alternative. This is meant to complement what other treatments are currently out there, not to replace it. If you're going to replace it and you're going to approach this, that cannabis is an alternative medicine compared to something that's complementary. Okay. And there are a lot of words that go into this as far as holistic. We were talking the other day about holistic word or complementary. Those are very different words than alternative, especially if alternative implies that you're going to reject the wonderful advances that Western medicine made to diagnostics and therapeutics. We're not pushing that away. We're bringing back some of the wisdom from perhaps Eastern cultures that have used this for thousands of years. We've only been here, 500 since Columbus. So the wisdom comes from what's in the past. Don't flush it down the toilet, as Dr. Chopra was mentioning there a moment ago on the other slide, because that cannabis smoke can turn into a little genie here. Anybody remember the parable about the genie? That kind of cautions you to be careful, because you make the 2 wishes with the genie, and what happens with that 3rd wish? It's the gotcha one, right? So a temptations indulgence actually does offer us choices right now. It cautions us to be careful with what we wish for, because science and reason really do matter. That's why I like to conclude with that same compelling theme. So moving forward then, that's it. We can take off the slide there, and everybody, Dr. ElSohly, where are you, Pete?
I'm here.
There you go. Okay, I'm going to sit down to my other panelists. And so with the time allotted, we're going to move kind of quick. And I have several thoughts and questions that we can use with panelists to reconfirm some of the things that we've said previously in the conference. This is the closing session, so we're wrapping up. I think I've talked enough about Delta 8. So Rod is a legislative maven who knows what's going on. Anything you can tell us about things involving Delta 8 that may be informative, because of the 50 states, about half have some disposition on it, some of which completely outlawed, some of which say don't give it to kids. Florida right now doesn't really have any firm disposition in law policy, but can you help us to, I'm going to say it this way, read the cannabis leaves of the future, not the tea leaves, but the cannabis leaves. You see anything happening in the Delta 8 horizon?
Well, thank you, Doc, and thanks everybody for being and staying here till the end. Interesting question. Legislatively, there was actually an attempt this last year to actually, I'll say corral the deltas. There was a bill filed that was going to take all the synthetic cannabinoids and add them together into a group and basically limit it to 0.5 milligrams and no more than 2 per package. Needless to say, the industry was not very happy about that, and I will give them incredible amount of credit for the way that they handled their lobbying aspect. They came to town in mass there was 40 or 50 people testifying at every one of their committee meetings. And instead of focusing on the, the synthetic side of this and how they produced it, they were very smart, because what they did was say, if you pass this bill, you're going to put 100,000 people out of work overnight in the state of Florida. And oh, by the way, you're going to be screwing all the veterans too, because the VA will not allow them to go get a medical card. And this is the only way that our veterans are being able to be helped by the plan. So again, I will give them a lot of credit. That bill turned around 180% halfway through session, to my great surprise, frankly. And all of those restrictions on the cannabinoids were removed on the deltas. And so there was some clarification in the hemp law. The previous law they had passed, it was only going to apply to inhalation over 21. So as Doc Block said, there really was, I mean, I don't think anybody's doing it, but right now, an 8-year-old can walk into a store and buy a gummy, and it's legal. That was a whoops they needed to fix. So there's some other language in the hemp bill that talks about what's attractive to children. They banned the advertising, as Doc showed. You can't have a Mars bar look exactly like, so they're trying to protect children. So that they did pass a hemp bill this year. We're still waiting for the governor to act on it. But I will tell you that it was greatly watered down. I'm the one that I love the plant to help anyone, but I'm more of the, if you can get it naturally occurring, that's the way I would go. One of my lines is, you can buy sushi in a gas station, but I'm not.
Thank you very much. And actually, as the state develops things, obviously, we've seen things with respect to marijuana as things were developing. And I showed one slide that talked about blue laws. I'll meet next Wednesday with the mayor of Miami. And remarkably, she controls a budget that is a larger budget than 8 states' governors control. And I was trying to get her input, even not only with this meeting, but one of the things we're going to talk about is Delta 8 as it impacts what I know is in Miami, because I give talks to garden clubs, including little old ladies who are garden club fans, and they've started asking me questions also about cannabis. But one of them said they were down in an area towards Homestead called the Redlands, and they went to a farm fest thing, lots of tours around, and even the mayor had a group, an entourage going to places. And this lady, about 80 years old, was given a little bag, and it was a gummy. Now, I'll point out something that Ron is not the scientist as far as knowing it, but remember, when you eat a Delta 8 gummy or a Delta 9 gummy, your body and liver metabolism is going to change it into something that is hydroxy 11, that particular chemical lasts approximately 3 or 4 times longer than the THC itself, and is approximately 3 or 4 times more potent. So this little old lady who was naive before she even finished driving home is starting to feel different. And it was only after she asked me at a garden club meeting, and she regards me as being fairly objective in this space. As a matter of fact, if you go to my website, it says Dr. Block is scrupulously neutral. Well, she's real cute because she didn't quite know the language there, and she's introducing me to her son, who's wondering why mom felt that way. She says, "Oh, Dr. Block is scrumptiously neutral." It's fun. It's funny. So anyway, that's a good example of somebody who was not a kid, but a senior citizen who got it, who really was not ready what hit her. And once that gummy goes in, it's not the next hour or so, like if it was smoked or vape, it's the rest of your whole day. And if it's a bad type of response, including certain things that are not just putting you to sleep, but getting you paranoid, which is for all indications likely what happens. Remember, those are isomers, 8 and 9. So they're likely to cause the same intoxicating effects, but also side effects. Very little known about it. So I can't really, and I won't say more on it because I want to be scrupulously neutral. So moving on then, I got something I want to ask Dr. ElSohly now, because this is, the book came out on Monday. In the back of your brochure, you'll see a little more about it. Cannabis Chemistry and Biology Fundamentals, graduate level book, a book entirely about cannabis. And not all of it necessarily has to be written on a highbrow level. There's enough of that in there, though, to where you'll see his expertise as a biochemist pharmacist in terms of what's in here. But I give the first chapter where I'm talking about the history a little bit, which is far more about hemp, by the way, as a textile than, and the history of use by man is far more with that than it is about the drug form or marijuana. But Dr. ElSohly, the paper came out already over 3 years ago. And I don't know how many people had heard about it before, but when it came out, it was like, whoa, this is important stuff. How long before that paper, because it takes a while before publication, were you thinking of intermediates, and what brought it to your attention? Because I believe it has tremendous clinical application.
Well, first of all, I started working on cannabis back in 1975, 76. In 1976, we had the United Nations Narcotics Division group actually bring international experts in cannabis research here to Oxford, Mississippi, to speak about or to talk about the chemistry and the botany of the cannabis plant. And excuse me. And during that meeting, the consensus of the expert group back in 1976 is that the cannabis plant cannot be divided into sativa and indica and ruderalis and so on and so forth. There is actually a single genus that has only one species, and that one species is a highly variable species, meaning that it will hybridize very easily. And we can see that now that really looking at all the high THC, for the lack of a better term, cultivars that are around all these days, they all look exactly very similar in terms of their chemical profile.
Oh, he froze up.
High CBD, and then the intermediate has always been there with the balanced levels of delta-9 THC and CBD. So the intermediate variety has always been around and has always been recognized way before the chapter in the book and the chapter, but the article that appeared in the Journal of Natural Products in 2020, or the book that you have in your hands today. So the actual classification of cannabis into 3 major varieties, if you will, 3 measures. Botanists have really not been in agreement with the classification, that much, and the debate continues to go on. But today, I think the consensus in the scientific community is that we have a plant that belongs to a family that only has one genus, and that genus is only one species, and that species is highly variable with subspecies or varieties within that species.
Thank you, Dr. ElSohly. And for those of you who remembered the slide I showed with Richard Evans Schultes, that black and white picture in Kandahar kneeling next to the plant, and I was telling you about the dominant genetics in it that have been used by industry as the darling of plants to breed with. I didn't tell you one thing when I was specifying about how much of the THC and the myrcene were dominant genetics. I didn't tell it to you, but it was the most obvious part of that picture, which is from 1973, 3 years after the Controlled Substances Act has the DEA in charge of looking for this stuff. The most remarkable part about that picture is, unlike cannabis sativa, which Dr. ElSohly just mentioned, everything are different variations of, that particular plant in Kandahar was a 4 or 5 foot at most squatty plant, not a big 20, 22 foot plant that grows that way in a matter of a few months. That's why hemp was so important as a textile for fabric, rope, sails of Columbus's ships made of it. What do you do with a 4 to 5 foot squatty plant? Why would it become the darling of industry in the mid 1970s and extending through the 90s? A 4 to 5 foot plant is easy to hide from a helicopter, isn't it? Yeah, and grow indoors. That's why its plant genetics are in everything today. Another consequence of prohibition. Where are you going to grow it? So, okay, let's move along then, because we just talked about the intermediates. So, hi, Pete.
Hello.
Hi, I'm going to ask you about intermediates in a minute, but first, because now we're talking about indoor growing, and this is what Pete does, and On the cover of Dr. ElSohly's book, you'll see the fields at the University of Mississippi. Believe me, he knows about growing it indoors, outdoors, and everything in between. But Pete's growing indoors, and as a result, we want to grow a clean plant. We don't want to use a lot of chemicals on it. I'm going to shift the chemical conversation in a little while down to Brian. But in the meantime, Pete, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's called IPM, Integrated Pest Management, and how we get clean plants, not simply plants that don't have black market contaminants like the vape oils did. That we said is not what you're going to see in the legal market. But you've been involved in the legal market. You've produced things. You've produced clean plants that you're not forced to treat with hard chemicals, things like that. Tell us what integrated pest management really means. What does it involve?
Well, thank you everyone for being here to the end and having us on. For me, integrated pest management is basically the heartbeat of the operation in itself with the plants. As a grower, today's market, whether it's medical or recreational, people want flavors, people want different cultivars, people want, it's very common for people, not like in wine where someone would buy a certain wine and stick to it. People hear like a lot of variation, especially in the last 10 years. So cultivars are always changing, or the word that's used in the industry with other growers is strains. But we don't use that here, as Dr. Block has taught me about 10 years ago. He corrected me. But in regards to my IPM, the first thing is, you have a network and you're going to bring in genetics that are proven. So first thing we have to do is prevent. And when I'm, in a facility that I'm working in now, 50,000 square feet, thousands of lights, there's a lot of capital invested, and all it takes is for an infestation, not just to ruin a crop, but to have to shut down the operation in order to clean up a mess that can be easily, that can easily happen by bringing in a plant and not being patient by doing a quarantine. So one of the first things that I do is I bring in genetics. First of all, knowing who I'm grabbing those plants from is key. That it's someone that I have a relationship with that is doing the same precautionary things on their end before they given that to me. And even then we go through a quarantine. And that's basically I'm vegging a plant, I'm growing it out, I'm vegging and I'm flowering it, then I'm going to have my own test results. So that's a process in itself. There's a lot of businesses out there that I've consulted throughout the years, a few more than I like to say here in Florida, that had no idea about IPM, and they're bringing in plants from Colorado, California, Oregon. They're not tested. Before you know, we have an issue, not just in a specific grow, but in the state. So prevention, observation. I'm always asking when I'm bringing genetics, genetic resistant. Is it a plant that's gonna give me trouble, or is it something that's gonna have some armor to help itself? And then we go into climate management. If my environment isn't right, I'm in trouble. That's the key in growing indoors. If it gets too hot, chances are, even with all the preventions, with air curtains, with lab coats, sanitation, there's talking hundreds of thousands of plants. It's easy for an infestation to occur even with all those barriers. So chemical controls is the last thing that I like to do. In the last 10 years, gotten into a lot of beneficial insects that, if everything is right, basically eliminate the use of having to use harsh chemicals. Even though in a regulated market, I get tested for everything. So most of my products, are organic for the most part. Maybe they're not OMRI listed, but they are, horticultural soaps and things of that nature. The last thing for me, Dr. Block, and is you just got to stay on top of it. If you to be a grower at a scale level like this, if you're lazy, it's not going to work. So and training your staff to do all those points on a daily basis and be very diligent in their work is key.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to continue with you a moment, Pete, because in a moment after that, we're going to shift over to the gentleman seated next to me. So I talked about one-to-ones. Dr. ElSohly's paper talked about one-to-ones, but you're the guy who's going to be making some one-to-ones. So one thing is getting the CBD and the THC in approximate balance, but as we also talked about, the user, the end user, the customer, they seem to react to and find certain smells and the terpenes to be there. So can you tell us in just maybe a minute or two, how you might go about recreating something that if I was to compare it to what was around years ago before the Controlled Substance Act, how would you recreate an heirloom varietal that may have been a one-to-one with something other than myrcene? For instance, pinene is known to reverse a lot of the forgetfulness that goes along with THC. What a good thing to compare with it, something high in pinene, not with the hypnotic effects of myrcene. That may be one example. Beta-caryophyllene, things for inflammation that actually are a different terpene, but things that are expressed, but in such small amounts. So if you want to try to have certain cultivars, or I should correct myself and say chemobars to be that specific, evolve that now are going to be throwbacks to things that are no longer there. We've got genetics, we've got CRISPR, where you can actually take some genetics from one plant, put it to another. But how might you go about developing, what do you have to feed into it? A one-to-one and have a robust terpene profile, but maybe not expressing those things that have been so popular because of previous dominant genetics.
We're looking for dominant terps, cultivars that have, that's, for example, ChemDog. ChemDog has caryophyllene, limonene, so, it's very fragrant. They've grown correctly and cured and dried correctly and everything's right. It has those terpenes in a higher content. So it's basically, it's just like, let's say, breeding dogs. You want a good stud dog and you want a good, female or bitch, as they say in the dog world. It's the same thing. It's what you start with. So, I'm not going to start with something that's not tried and proven. It's not, it's not checking all the boxes. I'm looking for a plant that has those characteristics in it. And then, what you see a lot now, and we've had deep conversations about this, Dr. Block and myself. A lot of these, cultivars nowadays are, a little bit watered down, and there's a lot of F1s, meaning it's a quick breeding. It's a one-time breeding, and they're getting, from that one-time breeding, thousands of seeds, and they're just picking a few and not really going through it. I like to start with proven, something that's proven, not with an F1 that, some see that they do great work, but it's not what I'm looking for, because what I'm going to end up getting is a lot of different variation. And at the end, it's going to cost me, take a lot more time than if I start with a plant or a mother or a female or a male to start that process.
Thank you. What people should know also is that you have hybrids, and then you have, obviously, the results of a hybrid represent some of the characteristics of each parent, depending on dominant or recessive genes. But at the same time, the cannabis plant is so prolific and easy to grow, not from tissue culture individual cells. If you're trying to produce an exact replica, that's done. And it's done by cloning, but it's a different type of a process from cells. Cannabis, of course, is so prolific, you take little tip cuttings and you have, again, the same genetics, but coming from a mother plant. And that's what Pete's stuck in Florida right now, tending for the precious babies that way. But the two techniques of growing is absolutely germane. So what I want to do in the last 10 minutes or so is sort of shift gears, because now we're talking about how the plants are thought through and should be grown. That's why I wanted to start off with two, I'm going to say professional growers. They have different markets. They're located in different places in the country, but two important people who know how to grow. Up here on the panel, though, we've got another consideration, because I'm going to start off actually with Ron, but then hand it over to Brian, mostly because there's been talk legislatively about homegrown. Now, what's homegrown? It's exactly what it is. What happens when the law allows you now to legally grow it in your backyard? Well, cannabis has been coming out of prohibition now since 1996. I'm going to give you a little historical footnote here. 1993 is when the actual endocannabinoid system was finished being defined by knowing what the body's own ligands are. So it doesn't surprise me that California was the first state to come out and make medical approved in 1996. So the West Coast of the country, California, Washington State, Oregon, they've been doing this a lot longer than we have. And there should be lessons learned that we can learn from what's the good things that happen in some states and what are the not so good things. And I'm going to give one more comment about the political process that, believe me, nobody knows it better than Ron here. But 1996 is about a quarter century ago. And we're still in prohibition, even though we know exactly how it works and the first state came out. My point is it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. We're looking at a quarter century. Does anybody know in the audience which state was the first state to go into prohibition well before the cannabis? Dr. Newton? You're correct, California in 1916. Okay, now, actually, the reason for that, 1916, there were a lot of events going on around that time, including the Spanish flu. But let me tell you, besides COVID, Spanish flu then, what else happened in 1916 that most people don't realize, which one of the reasons we went into prohibition, starting again, West Coast. Anybody know the name Pancho Villa? Okay, March 9th, 1916. He's not Mexican government. He has really peasants who were frustrated with the United States and different things leading from the war, leads 1,500 soldiers, banditos, coming in and kills Americans, takes over American soils. If anybody thinks the World Trade Center is the first terrorist attack on US, no, it's that, by very definition. So what happens? We become much more, geocentric, close the borders, don't let the foreigners in. And what's the foreigner coming in with? Pancho Villa? Marijuana. It's not Spanish word, it's a Mexican word, Mary Jane. That's what was associated with it. And if you think marijuana makes people passive, it's all in context, folks. That's why cannabis was vilified from that point forward, and why March 9th, the day that Meshulam died, ironically, and my own dad was born. March 9th in 1916 is when that event is happening. And if you don't think there was quick pushback, then which is the first state to push back, even though that invasion was New Mexico? California is the first state to outlaw what was associated with the foreigners coming in, marijuana. Now, that's in the earlier 1900s. Takes decades more till 1937 and even 1942 with the USB I showed you, where they stopped teaching about it. About a quarter century again of going into prohibition. These are sort of lessons. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. I'm optimistic that we're getting to the tail end of its prohibition, coming out of prohibition. But I think those historical footnotes letting you know that certain things we tend to repeat, even fear of foreigners, even today. So it's part of human nature, part of our political democratic process as trends work their way, generally West Coast to East Coast. But now we're going to talk about homegrown a minute in the context of what do we learn from what's happening over there with homegrown. And so I'm going to tell you a paper came out from looking in 1998, I believe, 1998, in Washington State, which at that point has more of a co-op. You can have your homegrown, bring it in. And so 28 samples of different cannabis grown by individuals in Washington State were analyzed, and 25 of them were tested for contaminants that were not insects, but the things that the individual homegrown growers had subjected their plants to keep their precious weed alive, looking good. And these are not professional growers like you have on the screen there in front of you. These were people who were doing it in their backyard, who would do anything they needed to keep their precious babies going, including putting some pretty darn dangerous chemicals on them. And while I can tell you what they are, when I'm sharing with you, 85% of those tested positive for pesticides, multiple contaminants containing levels to the tens of thousands of times more concentrated even than the label's supposed to recommend. And remember, these are things that you're taking in your body that the responsible homegrown grower is subjecting to. We know that humans have such affairs with their plants that they can't help, in this case, from treating them with damn dangerous stuff. And I can give you lists of what they are and their effects, but let's just say that these are things that have documented toxicities as carcinogens, neurotoxins, cholinesterase inhibitors, developmental and reproductive toxins, and endocrine disruptors. That's the nature of the family of medicines or chemicals that are used on plants. It's one thing if it's an ornamental plant, you're not going to take it in. But when you take it in, especially when you concentrate it in terms of a gummy that now you're eating, and you're eating that stuff, some of this stuff, like I said, gets in your genome and forever it's there. But that's the way that the manufacturers, Monsanto, et cetera, have these chemicals in there, which are very effective and frankly, kind of horrible for the environment. But we're not talking about necessarily organically grown even in Florida. There are certain things you can use but the idea is prevention. And that's the first key to the quarantine and things that Pete was mentioning. You try to start clean, grow it indoors and keep it clean so you don't have to use those things. Homegrown is not usually indoors that way. And when it is, and it gets subjected to people who don't know how or what to add from the label or don't even know how to read the label, they'll dump anything on it that they have to. That's already been evidenced in other states. Learn from it. So homegrown, there's another legislative measure that's been talked about. We even mentioned it briefly the other day. Any comments on that, Ron, before I turn just what those chemicals really mean over to Brian?
Trulieve has their constitutional amendment, smart and safe, but it did not include home grow. There's a lot of people upset about that. But I would remind everyone, as I did yesterday, because of single subject in Florida, it could not include both, or it would have been tossed by the court. So because of that, there is a separate constitutional amendment that is being proposed. It is at the very beginning stages. They have no money, and they have only until February of next year to gather close to 900,000 signatures. So because of single subject, there was an attempt to have a second constitutional amendment drafted, which has been done, it's been presented, and now they're in the process of trying to gather signatures. But it is a complicated, expensive endeavor that unless they get an influx of capital, I hate to say, I have a feeling may come in a little short. But there is another constitutional amendment out there. If you don't have the ability and if you believe in this and you want to, go support them. It would have to be implemented by the legislature. My personal opinion is I'm okay with home grow as long as it's for adult use. But for medical, from the sick people, me personally, I'm not necessarily a supporter of home grow, but that's just Ron Watson's personal opinion. I'd like to turn it over to Mary.
Yeah, and I want to sort of save the best for last here. Brian Pearson, he's associate professor of the Department of Environmental Horticulture at the University of Florida. He knows a lot about not only the chemicals, we talked a little bit about kratom the other day, but we're not here for kratom, we're here for cannabis. So knowing that the people who have spoken before you are accomplished growers, accomplished with understanding the legislative permissiveness or outlawing, how can you tell us really what we need to know as a PhD professor, sir, about just what we would want to know and what's essential to know to keep the cannabis that we're providing for our patients with recommendations? Remember, you can't prescribe this legally. It's a recommendation certification. That's it. But how about telling the folks out there a little bit about what you know about growing safely in the environmental horticulture realm?
Certainly, and thank you, Dr. Block, and thank you guys for hanging in here today. When it comes to cultivating cannabis, or any plant for that fact of the matter, the label is going to be the law. You may have heard that. You cannot apply a pesticide, herbicide, insecticide on a plant unless it's listed and approved for with the EPA for that particular plant. Given the fact that cannabis has been illegal for so many years, when we came into this legalized market and this young market relative to many other plant and agricultural commodities, there hasn't been time, effort, or sometimes even money to even evaluate whether these products are safe to apply on, let alone safe for human consumption. As of April 2023, there are 99 products with cannabis on the label. Only one of them is a conventional. All the others, the 98, are all biopesticides, neem oil, vinegar, stuff that would be generally considered safe. My team evaluates this at the University of Florida by applying different herbicides and insecticides on cannabis sativa to try to evaluate how it reacts, the plant reacts to it, cannabinoids react to it, and help determine if it's safe. To Pete's point, integrated pest management is a fantastic way where we can use various approaches, but in the context of homegrown or any grown, the bigger concern is what is the person growing the plants, applying to the plants, and how are they processing the plants, and is it being done in a safe manner? Since this is a relatively young industry, what I saw early on a decade ago was some pretty scary practices. People were taking practices from growing small amounts of marijuana illegally from their closets, from their garages, and applying some of those same techniques, unfortunately, some of the same compounds in a larger scale. And it's not just a homegrown matter, it's a matter of educating any grower to ensure what they're doing is safe and that you don't have a black eye for an emerging industry. A study in 2019 in Oregon looked at various recreational products and as well as medical marijuana being sold that was licensed. Sadly, 3 to 12% of the samples that were medical marijuana had higher concentrations than what was being sold for recreational marijuana. Again, licensed growers doing incorrect practices. Some of them may not even know that they were breaking the law and doing that process. So educating the growers, to me, is a big concern in what I try to do.
Okay. Ryan, thank you. So it's sort of a wrap now. Thank you for everybody sticking around for the very end. I just want to make one comment. I was part of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and that there's a lot of stuff covered here. It's a complicated subject, not only about the plant, but about the laws, the regulations, and the way that we've evolved. And if you could tell, I try to take some lessons from history to help figure that if we don't learn from it, whether it's in Washington State or the start of prohibition, there's lessons learned. It includes alcohol and tobacco and everything from cannabis before. If hopefully you like that kind of input, we're somewhat limited in terms of not just time, but what happens when questions and answers go back. I just spoke briefly with Ron. While it would be wonderful if we had the time and in this particular format, the ability to take lots of questions and answers, there's always this 7th annual rendition of this a year or so from now, Gene, in which case we will be able to include other topics. In particular, I thought that impaired driving is going to be that much more relevant. We will be able perhaps to look back at some of the things we talked about this year legislatively by this time next year. I think that by this time next year, you'll see many new licensees. And remember, the renewals with those licenses annually is well in excess of $1 million per renewal. There should be money coming into this, which allows us to better enforce, police, research, everything that goes along with adequate funding. And this is all pretty optimistic stuff. I'm sorry it's taken 10 years from the time of Florida's first, footstep into this to sense if the water's too cold or not, but we're immersed in it now. And we're immersed in it because unlike 10 years ago, there's well in excess of 800,000 Florida citizen patients getting it legally, in exception to all of those that are probably still doing it, at least on the black market, illegally. There is a safer product coming. There's more known about it every year. And there's more willingness to engage in these kinds of conversations with legislators, with law enforcement, with clergy, the patients, and everybody there. That's what makes what's called a bioethical discussion. It's no longer medical legal. That's failed miserably over the last 50 years. Keep it between doctors and lawyers. It doesn't go anywhere. Involve the whole community as part of the discussion, and we advance for the benefit of the whole community. So I think on that basis, the time clock just went down to 00. I assured Gene as our conference organizer that we would keep to the script, and we're done.
Thank you very much, panel. Real quickly, for those docs in the room that need CMEs, we still have some forms out there. Fill those in. If you don't have a chance to do it now, you can take them, fill them in, scan it, email me. Also, I'm sending everybody the evaluation. It's going to be online. It's a survey month to the week. I'll get that out. The CME docs, I've already sent it to you. So you all start filling that out. Thank you, everybody. Have a safe trip home, and we'll see you at some point next year.
All right, bye-bye.